Well guys, you know what time it is. I gotta pay my rent. At least that's what you're accusing me of doing. Bold of you to assume that I give anybody any money. But I digress. The last time I uploaded a quickie reading was on June 7th of this year, so I would say that I'm actually more than due. Today, we'll be reading Chris in English. Let's get right into this. I know socialize online. Chris's strangely appropriate PSN comment. Chris's English skills, like most other things he believes he's mastered, leave much to be desired. Much of this can be attributed to his autism, which often results in awkward speech patterns. Chris often shows little regard for even the most informal standards of spelling, grammar, punctuation, vocabulary, and form. Additionally, he uses obscure constructs that may be grammatically correct, but are also unnecessarily wordy, confusing, semantically vague, or atypical. Other habits, such as his use of y'all, ain't, dropped G's, running pronounced as runnin', and double negatives are clear markers of his southeastern regional accent. Still others are plain nonsensical, at least without prior knowledge of his idiolect. Chris spent his years of childhood mute and took on speech therapy classes at James Madison University. Strangely, his grasp on English actually appears to have grown weaker as he's become older, presumably due to his increased isolation, which has affected his English in general, as well as his broader grasp on linguistic communication. Quickisms. Chris has a tendency to make up his own words for things, then use them with reckless abandon while assuming whoever is reading or listening will be able to understand exactly what he means. As such, we get terms like b-dog and noviophobia. He also tends to reappropriate existing words and phrases, giving them new meanings based entirely on his own skewed logic. This is why in Chris speak, comeuppance isn't a fitting outcome for someone's deeds, and China isn't an Asian nation. In the case of words like the definite article duh, Chris might be trying to make a pass at using slang to sound casual and relaxed, but instead, he ends up sounding like a marketing executive desperately grasping for credibility. Other famous quickisms like tobacco, goes and gabion are the result of a different problem altogether. Chris is a man-child who can't even say out loud the names of objects or concepts which he finds repulsive, so he is forced to come up with euphemisms for these terms, which range from confusing puns to changing a single letter in a word, barely altering its pronunciation, such as goes. The use of these terms is a prime example of his immaturity. These quickisms combine with his speech impediment and his accent to form an unholy trifecta that defines his speech. With the constant stream of half-words and repetition, it is sometimes difficult to understand what exactly he is talking about. Any resemblance to actual English is tenuous at best. The words he uses are English, but the structure is far from proper. The fact his vocabulary is a bit lacking only compounds the situation. If I could have it my way, I'd make it illegal and forbidden to have homo men. Women are safe. Also, I would have the secondary definition of the word gay, being homosexual, removed from the word in the dictionaries, and all instinctions and sayings of the word will only legally be used to mean happy, as it was originally intended among things like deck the halls. Chris in an IRC chant from the 2nd of January 2009. As you can see from the above quote, this abuse of language isn't limited to the commonplace quickisms we've come to know. Instinctions is a word Chris made up for this passage to sound fancy and smart, but instead only makes him look like he doesn't know and or cannot spell the word instances. Playing fast and loose with language just further decreases the impact of whatever Chris is trying to say. Also of note is that Chris wants to make it illegal to use a word a certain way, which is staggeringly hypocritical given that, as aforementioned, he often ascribes his own nonsensical meanings to existing words and phrases. His own lexicon, like many other aspects of his personality, demonstrates how self-centered he is. While the whole purpose of language is to communicate thoughts and ideas to other people, he has managed to turn his vocabulary into a brick wall by crafting a mashed-together lexicon that makes sense only to him. Written language. Chris's writing is a complete mess from top to bottom, to put it lightly. For starters, he doesn't understand basic syntax and semantics, he uses words in the wrong context or as incorrect parts of speech. His grammar is also predictably abhorrent. For example, he refers to fingering as outer course, which incorrectly replaces the supposed prefix in, which leaves turcourse, which is not a word at all, while the correct prefix is inter, meaning between. Incidentally, outer course is an actual colloquialism meaning dry humping, not fingering. Similarly, the infamous stock reply used to address mailbag entries includes imputed as the past participle of input. The correct word is either input or inputted. Chris often misuses punctuation in many ways, with comedic results. In particular, he tends to not use hyphens when they're needed, but for some reason also add hyphens when they aren't needed, such as in his stock phrase sweetheart from the ground up. He clearly means he wants to create a relationship from the ground up. A literal interpretation, though, means he wants to create a girlfriend from something that's been ground up. Coffee, cinnamon, pepper, etc. Another prominent example is him writing rest assured as rest-assured, as if it were a hyphenated phrase and not an imperative statement. Because Chris feels the need to type things precisely as he would say them and worries he will be misunderstood in print, he makes heavy usage of repetition and a distinctive all-caps style, comparable to the style used in comic books and graphic novels, which have no doubt influenced him. He also tends to capitalize words at random, a common literary trait among autistics, especially nouns and those which hold importance to the sentence, or the ones that address important abstract concepts that Chris tries to systematically understand on account of finding them too complex and mystifying, similar to the old grammatical laws of the middle 1800s. Also owing to his highly recitative manner of writing, he often adds letters to words to emphasize them. While this on its own is not something unique to Chris, most other people would write so instead of so, for example. Chris, however, would only add one O to make so, which is rather amusing when read phonetically as it makes him sound like a stereotypical effeminate homosexual. And the only reason I have not had sex yet in my lifetime with a woman yet is because the whole time I have been shy. Kept down with the personal fear of nearly every woman I see being already paired up with a boyfriend. Chris proving that he never proofreads. Beyond these basic issues of grammar and capitalization, Chris's writings often lack focus. Much like a child, he has trouble concentrating on a single topic for extended periods of time, and he'll often veer off topic in order to babble about whatever is on his mind. This practice of writing stream of consciousness style, combined with his obvious disinterest in proofreading or otherwise checking over what he's written, inevitably results in a large number of confusing run-on sentences, and a copious amount of text in general, especially in the comics. You know, whoever wrote this page seems to have a lot in common with Chris. This page is unnecessarily wordy. A single sentence might cover multiple topics, often ones that don't have anything to do with the original subject matter. It doesn't help that Chris feels it's his obligation to be honest, which means he feels the need to mention irrelevant little details, as anything less would mean he's not telling the whole truth. It gives his writing a rambling, disjointed feeling, and makes it very difficult to understand what exactly his point is. Chris has demonstrated a particular ineptitude in his own usage of semicolons. Semicolons are used to connect two independent clauses together without a conjunction, and whatever succeeds a semicolon should be pertinent to whatever immediately preceded it. Chris, however, uses them to crudely string together two or more tangentially related thoughts into a sentence that is consequently incoherent to anyone and which causes confusion as to what Chris even means in the first place. Chris also frequently misuses the semicolon in character dialogue, using it where he should use a full stop, period, or something else entirely. While the movie women are just characters, Rose Chew is playing her own character as well. Also, there is more than one Rose Chew. Why do you think I've dubbed them respectively Bubbles Rose Chew, Angelica Rose Chew, and recently introduced Lolisa Rose Chew, of whom her boyfriend, Jamsta Sonichu, was the one who interviewed Blanca and her Jigglyami on radio station KCWC. Chris, somehow jumping from movies not being reality to his imaginary radio station. Spelling. It is well known that Chris has trouble with simple spelling, as evidenced by all the sick tags scattered around the quickie. Despite a myriad of other problems with Chris's writing, his poor spelling somehow manages to stand out. He has many rigid, totally consistent habits which he never corrects, such as substituting EIN for ENI, as in Senor for senior, and Janus as genius. Similarly, tear is how Chris spells out the word tier on his Patreon page. Chris often spells difficult words phonetically, like a grade school child learning literacy. For example, spelling caricature as CHARACITURE, rather than taking a few seconds to spell check them in any dozens of programs available that would automatically correct his spelling. Long after fans discovered his comics, it was realized that the term ancient is supposed to be a pun, and not another instance of Chris's butchery of the English language resulting from U and I being adjacent on the QWERTY keyboard, as most had originally assumed. This largely goes to show that Chris's ability to spell correctly is so noticeably poor that when he deliberately misspells something, it goes unnoticed for years. In 2014, when he started dating the British-affiliated Catherine, Chris arbitrarily began to use British spellings, especially the word color, spelled COLOUR, since this was particularly relevant to his protest du jour. By March 2015, he was still using these spellings, using the dumb excuse that he was of British ancestry. He has been observed to inconsistently use UK English spellings as recently as May 2022 in his letter to Kingle following his return to Central Virginia Regional Jail. Typos. The above spelling problem is only compounded by Chris's constant typos. The very first sentence on the first page of the comic contains the word miles instead of miles, and even when he edits pages that contain mistakes and has a chance to fix them, he invariably misses them a second time, like dude instead of good in issue 7. The fact these typos exist only goes to prove that Chris does not bother to proofread his works even a single time after completion and prior to uploading them to the internet. And assuming that he has read his own comic at some point or another, and that someone must have drawn his attention to these mistakes at some point, the only logical conclusion is that Chris cannot be bothered to go back and fix these typos even when he is aware of them. Chris acknowledged these spelling mistakes in a tweet in July 2017, claiming that these typos are etched in history forever. Definitions and vocabulary. Chris has a very bad habit of not knowing what he's talking about, and this is readily observable in his vocabulary, beyond the above quickisms. Chris believes that the word naive means stupid, and thus hates being called it. Naive in simple terms means ignorance or gullibility because of a lack of experience. Therefore, this word accurately describes Chris because he doesn't do anything, and because he's that gullible and ignorant. Another word Chris throws around with wild abandon is slander. Chris constantly calls his ED page in the quickie slanderous. Slander is defamation. Defamation is the destruction of reputation or character through manipulation of video, photographic, and audio evidence. Libel is like slander, but is defamation through writing. There's two things wrong with Chris's use of slander. His ED page in the quickie consists of more written material than videos, photographs, and audio, so if it was anything, it would be libel. The other is that the ED page and the quickie are neither slander nor libel, because nothing on them is manipulated and everything on them is true, and backed up with evidence provided by none other than Chris himself. Related to his choice of vocabulary, Chris has an issue with using terms that, while technically meaning similar things, have different tones. This is perhaps most evident in Sonnet 10, where Chris uses the term bearing false witness multiple times. In the context Chris uses the term, he's simply using it as an alternate way of saying lying or misrepresenting, as the biblical term is often simplified when explaining the 10 Commandments to children. Chris fails to realize that the term is more or less exclusively associated with the Bible, and using it when discussing himself makes the characters sound like they're referring to Chris as their god, although this may have been intentional. Likewise, the Asperchew characters have claimed to have been forced to make a false idol of the brown-shirted one, even though in Asperchew, the protagonists merely respect their creator, rather than worship him. Again, the use of the biblical terminology makes the whole thing seem even more narcissistic. Repetition. Chris frequently repeats himself verbatim, which does little except to gradually annoy whoever he's addressing. This is most apparent in his attraction sign, but is cropped up in numerous places. He frequently describes his ideal girl as a boyfriend-free girl to make into a sweetheart from the ground up. This clunky phrasing is reiterated in almost every iteration of the sign, both online and off. He makes copious usage of his joke that date Ed sounds like dated, and has repeatedly blamed the infinitely high boyfriend factor for his woes. This repetition is not limited to his written communication. For example, he has often described his father as having starting more arguments than flies in a garbage dump, notably in his phone conversation with Casey's father. During the 2008 election, Bob joked to Chris that Obama would paint the White House black if he was elected. Chris seemed to take this literally, incorporated the joke into Sonnet 8, and even got his father to sign the page. And years later, he still occasionally talked about the former president repainting the White House. Clearly, something about these exact phrases causes Chris to reuse them over and over, verbatim, when describing the same problem in different conversations and context. It's tempting to just blame his autism for this repetition, which is likely a factor. However, much like his life in general, not all of his failures at communication can be the product of his autism. Other possibilities include that Chris struggles to form sentences, and when he does so successfully, he tends to reuse what he knows, or believes to be a working formula. Chris mistakenly thinks his peculiar constructions are funny and uses them to get a laugh, much like his one original joke. Chris is so lazy that he literally copy and paste text, or simply copies in the case of non-digital media, from his earlier screeds and manifestos into his new ones. Chris is so terminally unimaginative that he cannot think of more than one way to express a given idea. Given what we know about Chris, any or all of the above are possibilities. A large number of the phrases that are collectively known as quickisms follow the above pattern. Piecemeal language use. Chris's phrase usage is a deep-seated issue, to the point that it's almost possible to imagine that he copies all of his phrases from somewhere, even when he has not used the phrase previously. People usually learn idioms from other people when they hear them in an appropriate context, but though Chris may experience such a context, it will often fly straight over his head, and accordingly he has problems fully understanding the meaning of the phrase. Like most of us, he obviously has learned some phrases from the world around him, and he sort of understands what they mean and sort of uses them in the correct context. Despite this, it is as if he just learned the phrases and, like some foreign English student, is making the first awkward steps towards using them properly. Unlike those curious foreigners, however, Chris is not worried about getting punched in the face by the natives for abusing beloved idioms. To an outside observer, many of Chris's phrases almost always appear out of place and tacked on. This can manifest itself in even very small examples, such as the video title New Address. The video isn't about any sort of address change, as the phrase was intended to imply, but rather is an address to a specific individual, one that is newly released. It is akin to a foreigner opening a phrasebook, finding the entry New Address, and saying, okay, that is probably close enough, it has new and address in it. For more blatant examples, in the Clyde and Tito PS3 emails, Chris continually demands legal, unmarked, non-consecutive bills to be mailed to him. He probably thinks it's some sort of thing that people generally say when they want cash mailed to them, without realizing that he has picked this expression up from crime fiction where that kind of phrase is just said as part of a ransom demand. Also, when listing his definitely ancient television on Craigslist, he demands cash only and upfront, $250 or better offer, no haggle, which doesn't apply at all to something like an old TV, and directly contradicts his own offer. Regarding no haggle or a better offer, it is clear that he has no clue what haggle even means. He most likely picked up the jargon from other entries on the site. Semantics. As demonstrated in Quickisms above, Chris has severe problems understanding the meanings of words and just about anything even marginally abstract or metaphorical. A Facebook status reveals that, through unknown means, he has come to believe that empirical means rejecting scientific methods of knowing, which is more or less the opposite of the word's actual meaning. Since his source for this is listed as Jeremy Hillary Boob, PhD, a character in Yellow Submarine, perhaps this odd idea came from content in the Beatles' edition of Rock Band. He described the word benevolent as sounding derogatory. He might have mixed it up with belligerent, which means warlike or malevolent, an antonym of benevolent. Years later, in 2016, Chris demonstrated his lack of political understanding in a post on the 4th of December, in which he said that Trump should, quote, advocate the position and take Pence with him and let Hillary be president, as it should very well be. Chris likely has the word advocate confused with abdicate, which is a term he might have heard in British TV shows. It is a term typically used in reference to a monarchy. Muddled up proverbs. A good demonstration of Chris's lack of understanding of semantics is in the fact that he does not really understand proverbs and adages. He frequently recites them incorrectly, clearly misses the point, or takes them literally. When he comes up with his own, he does not exactly try to veil any wisdom in carefully crafted phrases. Examples of Chris Verbial wisdom. Those who are unable to, teach. The shaped object is the body of the item, but the sticker is the item's soul. A sound thought is a good thought, unless it is a bad idea. The pen is mightier than the sword, yet it is more permanent than a pencil. The last example illustrates several problems. The pen is mightier than the sword, a phrase originally coined by Edward Bulwer Lytton, the man who also coined the phrase "it was a dark and stormy night," is, of course, generally regarded as a statement that words have bigger consequences than violence. Chris does not understand this, and somehow tries to interpret this concretely: pen is more permanent than pencil. He doesn't understand that pen could easily be replaced with pencil or keyboard in the original saying. It's a metonym for the written word. It's also problematic because normally A yet B is usually a statement by contrast. A may be true, but a contrary example B is true as well. One would think that a pen being permanent makes it more mighty. Still, Chris fails at explaining why it is so important that pens are more permanent than pencils, and what that has to do with the original phrase. The meaning of Chris's proverb remains unclear to all, probably including Chris himself. Perhaps it's simply another form of random access humor. Literal interpretations. Chris is unable to interpret the language other people use at any level other than its literal surface meaning. He misses the deeper meanings of what others are trying to say to him, and cannot interpret abstract thought or sarcasm. This is known as concrete thought, which can be seen as a symptom of autism. Rhetorical comparisons and sarcasm. Chris cannot interpret rhetorical comparisons or hyperbole in general. He ignores the point the speaker is trying to make and focuses on the exact meaning of the phrases they use. For example, you know, I think the last book Casey read was last week, and she reads books like you probably stuff candy down your throat. Stuff? Candy? Don't. I stuff vegetables down my throat. I stuff green beans. I stuff broccoli. I stuff corn. I stuff carrots. I don't know shit about computers, and I can do that. I barely even know what a Windows is. You barely know what a Windows is? Don't patronize me. I'm just trying to understand what you just said. You said you don't understand Windows? What I'm trying to say is, I don't know shit about computers, and I could figure out how to do that. In the first example, Chris clearly only hears "you stuff candy down your throat" and interprets a negative tone as an accusation that this is a bad thing. Then tries to prove that he does not, in fact, stuff candy down his throat. Just healthy foods like vegetables, a blatant lie, but that is beside the point. Because he feels threatened, he forgets that this is used as a rhetorical comparison, and thus the original point Casey's dad was trying to make gets lost in the sands of time. This is also one of the reasons why conversations with Chris reach complete dead ends. As the quote read in the Autism Awareness video says, autistic people are frequently unable to interpret sarcasm. Chris is no exception, and he is often unable to pick up on sarcastic comments, as seen in the Guru Larry interview. Questions and suggestions. Chris's literal interpretation also affects how he answers questions and follows orders or suggestions. His answers to questions are always laconic with no elaboration, and cannot distinguish the implied meanings within the commands and suggestions given to him from their literal meanings. For example, do you listen to any music while you draw the comics? Yes. To a normal person, the question that was posed would be interpreted along the lines of what kind of music, what bands, what musical genres. If you listen to the music, why does this particular music help you draw things? If not, do you find music distracting, and why? But instead, Chris interpreted, do you listen to any music, literally as a question that can be answered yes or no. Simply put, he is unable to see why people are asking specific questions that can be answered yes or no, and unable to elaborate or give rationales for his opinions unless those things are specifically asked from him. Again, this characteristic is due to his autism, not, as often perceived, his stupidity. Another example. Please stop running away from me. I'm not running away from you, I'm right here. This was in response to Chris trying to leave the call after an inconvenient discussion. This also is likely to blame for Chris's second encounter with B Manager. The previous day, the manager of the Walmart had banned him from the store. Problem is, they were inside a McDonald's at the time, and he likely said something along the lines of, never come to this store again. Chris probably took this to mean, you are banned from this specific store, the one you and I are standing in right now, and due to this misunderstanding, he wound up being chased out of the Walmart. Television jargon. In the Sonichu comic, Chris also almost consistently uses television terminology instead of comics terminology. This seems to seep into his other language use too. He urges people to stay tuned to see new developments in his YouTube channel, for example. This on its own is innocuous, as normal people might use stay tuned in non-TV situations and for cable and satellite TV stations which do not have a transmission frequency. But in Chris's case, this may be an indication of a bigger issue. Chris refers to himself as the Great Director Chandler, itself a ripoff of Great Director Watanabe, and calls alternate versions of his comics director's cuts. Sonichu number 10 begins with a previously type of recap of the end of the previous comic more usually seen in a TV series. When talking about the comic, he consistently refers to episodes rather than chapters. He has used TVMA, TV14, and TVY7 ratings for certain scenes, and when this self-imposed rating system later failed to work, he blamed the Federal Communications Commission for the messed up ratings, even though the FCC has no authority over online or printed media. He promised a second season of the comic. Apparently, a reboot will commence with the clip show episode in Sonichu 11. It is as if he is familiar with only one set of jargon that he then applies to all similar situations, ignoring the fact that most people speak of writers instead of directors, chapters instead of episodes, volumes instead of seasons, rate their comics with some rating system that is probably similar to but not an exact duplicate of the one used on television, and so on. It is speculated that the use of jargon stems not from a limited vocabulary, but Chris's belief that he is actually directing a TV show. More damningly, he once referred to the comics as an anime with himself as director. Backwards spelling. Chris also has a habit of spelling certain words, phrases, or names of people backwards in order to emphasize them in a sentence. In Chris's mind, words wield a great deal of power, and spelling a name or word backwards can serve to degrade its subject or indicate that Chris views it negatively. Notable examples include Reldnak Natsunatsuk, Chris's doppelganger who is his exact opposite, being completely evil and extremely gay. Haslaw Il Ram, Chris's reversal of Mary Lee Walsh's name in one of his custom Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Pmert, Trump backwards, rhymes with hurt. Sometimes the P is silent. Eed, Pmert, eed! Namgay, used by Chris to refer to Eggman from Sonic, pronounced like nah, I'm gay, with the words slurred together a bit. Whim, used by Chris to refer to the Pokemon Mew. Drantsab Niarteb, calling Noel a betraying bastard in his jail correspondence. Reeb, for beer. Other strange points. Chris seems to cling to trademarks. In mailbag number 10, for example, he specifically says a couple of times that he has saved material on his memory stick in Memory Stick Duo, not saved on memory card or just saved. People generally don't care what you save your fan art on, as long as it's saved. Chris, however, wants to be specific. The fan material was saved on a Memory Stick Duo. In the exact same vein, in Clyde and Tito PS3 emails, he even swears with, "Hand on my holy new International Version Bible right now," rather than just any old Bible he might have laying around. This can be explained again by Chris's autism, where he is literally describing the specific device that he is using to save, not a generalization. He also tends to mix up similar words. For example, the time he confused free running with a brand of butter. You know, parkour and parquet.
Hello there, fans. This is Christian Chandler here live at the Downtown Mall, where for the Sonichu franchise from the city of Quickville and everything like that, I'm going to do a parquet from this point all the way down to the parking garage, where at the end we will get a nice view of the tent-style theater that's down there where events are held. the amphitheater. Thank you for your continued support.
Chris seems to prefer referring to people using their full names. Before he assumed he was female, he almost always referred to himself as Christian Weston Chandler, or, God forbid, Christopher Christian Ricardo Weston Chandler, if he was feeling overly formal. This applies to other people too. For example, in Gal Pals and Past Sweethearts, he refers to most of the women by their full names. This is yet another autism-related trait. Chris also has a habit of inventing new words by muddling the tense of existing ones. This often goes along with his previously mentioned preference for somewhat odd word choices as he tries to force words into sentences they don't belong in. A good example would be Chris's love for the word crestfallen that came about during the Sonic Boom protest. While the word usually exists as an adjective, Chris uses it in a baffling progressive tense, to my dismay and crestfall. The spoken word. Chris comes off slightly better when speaking, although that's not really saying much. He claims ad nauseum the first word he ever spoke was monkey at the age of 6 weeks, which is physically impossible. When he addresses the word in one of his many videos, his speech is peppered with vocalized pauses such as and yeah, as he struggles to find the right thing to say. He also tends to stutter and repeat himself. They should have given it perfect. They should have given it 5 out of 5 stars and 10 out of 10. Between G4 and the Game Informer. Chris, attempting to convince people that Brutal Legend is worthy of a perfect score. Chris does a better job staying on topic when speaking than he does while writing, likely because when speaking to a camera or another person, he has a clear idea of the point he wants to get across. Going off on rambling tangents still occasionally happens, but usually only when Chris is trying to be funny. Even to make his own ass bleed. I mean, that story, it's just about as incredibly fabricated as Donna Tubbs' time over at when she had to borrow R. Kelly's bathroom. The Cleveland Show, new episode every Sunday on Fox. Chris, confusing humor with advertising. While Chris seems to be at least capable of coherent conversation while calm, things go downhill when he's upset, enraged, or confused. In particular, his tendency to throw childlike temper tantrums has resulted in some very bizarre outbursts. When angry, Chris still retains his tendency to go off on tangents and be very proper about compulsively giving all of the relevant information, which means he's often unable to sum his anger up in just a few succinct words. So get it through your damn fucking skull and call me the real name that God has given me and the bear at the Regency Square Shopping Center during 1989, you damn mocking bastard! Chris, inserting random details into a hissy fit. Interestingly, comparisons of his vocal patterns offer one of the few signs of actual development that Chris has ever displayed. Consider his earliest videos. His speech was courtly and disjointed, and delivered almost exclusively in short, monotonous bursts.
It has come to my attention that I have a lot more fans of my electric hedgehog Pokemon Saichu than I had originally thought. And I thank each and every one of you for your support. And I will draw more comics when I get some positive inspiration or when I feel like it.
There are exceptions to this, but these generally consisted of short phrases apparently culled from TV. Note the change in pitch from the above video when Chris describes himself as ever so lonesome. All in all, Chris displayed all the attributes one would expect from an autistic, as well as someone who is completely unused to talking to people. Comparisons with the present day show a marked change in Chris's manner of speech.
First off, a couple of small announcements. I'm possibly in talks with AD Vision about a project, possibly, but also, hi Ginger. Alright, so with that aside, let's get down to the meat here.
Chris may not sound any more naturalistic, but he does show more of a semantic range than he did 2 years ago. Clues as to why this has occurred can be found in the subject matter of the videos. Chris seems to have realized to some extent that he must engage with people on their terms in order to be taken seriously. While this may not be a massive change, it is still heartening to see the trolling is stirring the emaciated husk of his dignity into some sort of creaking action. Who knows? In another 2 years, he may have acquired the vocal skills of a child of kindergarten age. Idiosyncrasies. Chris also has a number of idiosyncrasies which appear frequently in his speech. First, the aforementioned disjointed speech patterns, which are broken up by a number of ideological phrases which crop up with varying regularity but which sound very similar every time he uses them. Listen closely to the way he introduces himself. He is Christian Weston Chandler from Ruckersville, Virginia. When Chris introduces himself, he basically repeats this exact phonetic pattern, including pauses, the rushed and garbled name, and the staccato rhythm of Virginia. This is of course explainable by his autism, but it is also related to his sense of humor, his plagiarism, and his desire for control over those whom he sees as oppressors. It may also be related to the less often seen idiosyncrasy which causes him to express disgust with the word physically. For example, the famous Smell Yo Duck music video. Chris first avoided saying the word dick altogether, and when forced to repeat the video, showed signs of distress bordering on illness. While this is obviously nothing more than a comical exaggeration on his part, it is notable that he should feel any particular sensation about simple words whatsoever. This reaction raises the possibility that, so long as he is not faking it altogether, Chris may be a synesthete. There is also the possibility that he has a strong association with a certain word and associates guilt with it, like a child hearing a curse word. Alternatively, it is not stating the word that is disgusting to Chris, but rather the substance of the phrase, as it implies that he himself is smelling someone's dick, as he has no problem hurling curse words, including dick, at his enemies when in a fit of rage. Profanity. At some point in the 2000s, Chris became an enthusiastic user of profanity and vulgar language. According to Mims, in his early days at the gameplays, Chris avoided cursing, at least in public. But in more recent years, he's lost almost all compunctions in this regard. His videos, blogs, and public pronouncements are full of foul language and obscene references. This is possibly part of an effort by Chris to seem more adult. He still holds back in some ways, though. In much of his writing, especially in his comics and on the Wikipedia, Chris shows a strange inclination to sporadically censor himself. He regularly uses profanity in his blog entries and mailbag responses, but the offending words are typically blotted out with asterisks. D, that son of a B. Clyde Cash, for instance. Or, Bugs Bunny was naked, Yogi Bear was naked, what the F is wrong with you? On occasions, he varies up his censorship style. Quick's diary repeatedly refers to Mary Lee Walsh as an XXXXX. The X's are clearly meant to stand in for bitch. Even relatively mild words such as damn and crap get the same treatment, which was exploited to hilarious effect in the audiobooks. It could be that Chris believes that most of the Wikipedia's audience is comparatively young, and therefore censors his outbursts to protect his imagined fanbase. Another more complex theory proposes that it's a sign of Chris's stunted maturity. He wants to use profanity to signify that he's an adult, but he retains a child's guilt and uncertainty about swearing. The same theories abounds regarding David Gonterman, another angry internet cartoonist with an incongruous tendency to censor himself. Virginia is for virgin ears. The usage of profanity, even in private, was illegal in Virginia until 2020. However, this law was seldom forced. Nowadays, even swearing in public is legal in Virginia. However, Virginia law still prohibits the use of profanity over the telephone, airwaves, or other electronic methods, which would include YouTube videos. Much of Chris's output is technically illegal. Chris hasn't been prosecuted for this, though, and as such, a prosecution would be flimsy under the First Amendment if it were ever tried in a state or federal high court. State courts have neutered similar laws on the books in other states, including California, which only enforces its offensive language disturbing the peace laws when immediate physical violence or physical provocation ensues, even if the profanity occurred in public. Still, private businesses in any state are free to enforce bans on vulgar language. And that's it for Chris in English. But because I'm a nice guy, I'm gonna go ahead and read one more short page for you. This one is going to be Chris in Spanish. Let's get right into it. Spanish is a Romance language with over 489 million native speakers. It is also a common second language choice for millions more, including our favorite linguistic autistic who knows un poquito but still acts like a fluent speaker. He often uses Spanish in his videos and comics, as it was one of the few things that he learned at Manchester High School, however poorly. He often refers to himself by his Spanish name, Ricardo. Chris is proud of his tenuous grasp on the Spanish language, but this has not prevented racism against Hispanics, creating a stereotypical babysitter in his comics and a highly stereotypical sombrero-wearing Pokemon called Espinolic, who, quote, confuses its enemies with its language. Based on his vocabulary, and the fact that it's the most common Spanish dialect taught in American high schools, Chris most likely learned the standard Latin American dialect. Chris's knowledge of the language. Chris's actual grasp of the language must be inferred from various sources. The Manchester High leaks in his Hotel Ricky Ricardo project indicate that Chris took Spanish 1 in his junior year, 1998-99, and Spanish 2 in his senior year, 1999-2000. Chris's grades are unknown, but he seems to have done well enough to pass both classes. On OkCupid, Chris claimed to speak Spanish and wrote a large section of his profile in it, which was riddled with mistakes. He also states that he speaks Spanish on his resume, but mentions that he only has taken 2 years. He has also written some Sonichu comic pages in Spanish. Chris seems confident in his Spanish, despite plentiful evidence suggesting his grasp of it is feeble. He frequently makes mistakes of grammar, spelling, and pronunciation, and only employs the most basic verb of conjugations, such as the present indicative. Chris never expressed his interest in taking classes or other instruction beyond high school to reach fluency, nor has he deliberately practiced his Spanish with native speakers. He seems to view his Spanish skills as a means of showing off and not a communication tool. Some of Chris's mistakes in Spanish seem to have crossed over from his stunted command of English, such as his affinity for the written sequence ein, resulting in, for example, bine instead of bien. Chris's inconsistent use of symbols which do not occur in English when writing Spanish, such as inverted punctuation, accented vowels, and, most significantly, an end with a tilde. The inverted punctuation marks are sometimes replaced with the respective upright marks, and accents with an apostrophe before the vowel, while the tilde in the end is often omitted entirely. The fact that he sometimes uses the proper characters indicates that he knows how to enter them and simply does not care enough to do so consistently. In some of Chris's Tomgirl era Spanish writing, notably Sonnet 12, Chris uses feminine nouns and adjectives when referring to mixed gender groups, whereas Spanish grammar rules dictate using the masculine plural in these contexts. This could be a subtle attempt at a feminist statement, but knowing Chris, it is likely a simple error. In Chris's July 29, 2009 video to our true and honest hero, he displays his grasp on Spanish, basic as it may be. It can be safely assumed he used online Spanish dictionaries for words he did not know. He also mispronounces some of the most common Spanish words, bueno, good, and well, as bueno. Another video involving Spanish is U8C43P2A37A8 and U8C1N023V0L, a weird lead Spanish title, in which he says love sonnet you and hate asper you backwards in English, surrounded by a sentence in awkward Spanish. In another display of his Spanish, his old Spanish assignment to create a hotel was released online. This assignment is mostly just basic Spanish and not very advanced. In Mumble 2, Chris briefly attempts to have a conversation with a Mexican troll but fails to understand his question. ¿Has estado en Mexico? Have you been to Mexico? Even after it is repeated multiple times with different wording. Chris probably never learned the present perfect verb tense, or if he did, he is not able to recognize it in its spoken form. Ricardo Weston Chandler. Ricardo Weston Chandler is Chris's Spanish nom de guerre, presumably chosen in honor of a main character in one of Chris's favorite TV shows. Students in language classes often choose an alternate name in the language they are learning to get into the culture and language. Of course, while most people forget about this when they have left the course, or even the teachers abandon the practice shortly into the course, Chris has adopted Ricardo as his actual Spanish name and uses it for his Spanish-related endeavors. He is oblivious to the fact that, while learning another language, people generally do not change their name, but instead use a language's native form of the name. If no native equivalent exists, they may adapt it to fit the language's pronunciation and spelling rules, i.e. L becomes R in Japanese. Christian without the H is actually a rather common name in the Spanish-speaking sphere. Weston can be adapted as Houston or loosely translated to Del Oeste, of the West. Chandler can be translated as either Candelero or Bolero depending on which meaning we're going with. Christine becomes Christina, and Christopher becomes Cristobal. Chris has plenty of options. Furthermore, modern Spanish speakers rarely translate names of non-royalty, just as English speakers don't refer to every Maria as a Mary. The practice of adopting a Spanish name while learning the language is purely for immersion purposes. It is not a reflection of how native Spanish speakers actually talk, at least not in the 20th and 21st centuries. Of course, it must be noted that Ricardo's linguistic skills have brought us gems such as noviophobia, from the Spanish novio, meaning boyfriend. It should also be noted that Ricardo is the Spanish and Portuguese version of the name Richard, which is sometimes shortened to Dick. Chris's attachment to his Spanish name has not abated to this day, and he has listed the name prominently alongside his more common aliases, Christopher, Christian, and Christine. However, Chris has yet to pick a feminine Spanish name in agreement with his current gender identity, suggesting he has largely abandoned the concept of having a Spanish alter ego. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of both articles. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video because I've had a lot of fun reading the writings of other people. It's kinda my thing. I also just think it's fun to say reading the writings of other people, but I digress. But with that being said, that's gonna be it for today's video. If you like what I do, leave a comment, rate, and subscribe. If you want to support me in a more personal way, you can check out the Patreon link and the Teespring link in the description. I've got more content coming down the pipeline. But until then, I'll see you degenerates next time.